Welcome, everybody. It's 6 o'clock. Here we go. I'm Nicole Kemeny. I'm the president of 350 Silicon Valley, if you haven't met me before. A big thank you to everybody for joining us on Zoom tonight. I think it's going to be fascinating. There are also many people that won't be with us, but will be viewing the video later and being with us virtually in both time and space. Our current fundraising campaign, of which this event is a part, is critically important to 350 Silicon Valley continuing to improve our reach. We're very excited to host tonight's conversation about ExxonMobil's remarkable public slip-up and what happens next. In many ways, we see the activist climate movement as first and foremost countering the multinational fossil fuel industry. We're working every angle we can think of to loosen those companies' death grip on the global economy. Our guests tonight are at the very heart of that work. Their peer-reviewed research informs not only the campaigns of activist organizations like ours, but also the growing number of lawsuits against the oil companies, the policies of the Securities and Exchange Commission under the Biden administration, as well as federal legislation like a new bill announced by Democratic senators yesterday, which asks the Treasury Department to tax the largest emitters to pay the costs of the climate crisis. We thank our guests for their work, and we are grateful to them for making this conversation possible. Geoffrey Supran, oh, I hope I pronounced your name right after asking you.
Not too bad.
Supran, published the first peer-reviewed analysis of ExxonMobil's 40-year climate crisis denial tactics back in 2017. Currently, he's the director of climate accountability communication at the Climate Social Science Network at Brown University and a research associate in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard, where he collaborates with Professor Naomi Oreskes in the History of Science department. He is also a frequent contributor and media commentator for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times, the Guardian, and the PBS NewsHour. Ben Franta is a co-founder of the Climate Social Science Network at Brown and a frequent collaborator with Geoffrey there. He holds a PhD in applied physics from Harvard, a JD from Stanford Law School, and is currently studying the history of fossil fuel producers and climate change politics in pursuit of a PhD in history at Stanford. Ben's research and writing on the politics of the climate crisis has appeared in Nature, Climate Change, The Guardian, and Project Syndicate, and has been cited in the US Congressional Record. Our legislation director, Janet Cox, will be moderating tonight's conversation, and then we'll give you, the members of the audience, the opportunity to ask questions of Ben and Geoffrey. Please put your questions in the chat or just raise your Zoom hand at the beginning of the open Q&A session, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the hour we have. Is there anybody who needs a brief orientation on how to raise your hand on Zoom or how to access the chat function? If so, can you wave or something? If need be, Carl can help. Carl, is there anybody you're spotting at all looking for help?
Like we're good right now.
Yep. Okay. Great. Okay. Thanks. All right. Please do keep in mind this is a fundraiser. We'll put the link to our donation page in the chat a few times in case you're moved to give. We're nearly at our goal of $10,000 raised to be matched by our board members. And we're very grateful that we're so close to our goal, but it's really only the beginning. So thank you so much for your attention and enjoy tonight. That's it for me.
So I think, am I up? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Welcome everybody. This is going to be super interesting. We're going to start out with our special guest, Keith McCoy from Exxon, who you may have seen in this video before, but from watching it a few times, I'm telling you, you can't watch it too many times because there's a lot here. So Carl, please roll the tape. Amazing. So I'd like each of you to take about 5 minutes and tell us, what did you think when you saw this the first time, and a little bit about your work that's going on. And then we've got some questions and topics we'll take up with you, but we'd just like to hear your general comments and your reactions to this very interesting tape. So Ben, can we start with you?
Sure. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for the work you're doing. I think this is the most crucial work. Sometimes we think a lot about what policymakers are doing or politicians, but it's the pressure from grassroots, I think, that is the tide that rises. That's what shifts the entire center of gravity for the issue and changes politics. So thank you very much for everything you're doing, all the time you're putting in, all the work, everything. When I saw this video, I think what it did was allow a window into the inside room. We're used to seeing the public pronouncements of companies like ExxonMobil. And, I think for some of us who've been working on climate for a long time, we see them saying they promote or support a carbon tax, or they support the Paris Agreement or something. And we know about all the lobbying activity they've done that contradicts that stance, but yet many people who are not as familiar with the politics, they take that public pronouncement at face value. And what this video does is it's a small keyhole into, those inside discussions, why Exxon is saying what it is in public, and how it's part of its strategy to perpetuate fossil fuels for as long as possible. And so, I just as we watched it, I wrote down, just a bunch of thoughts, and, I just sort of offer these as reactions, really. First of all, of course, there's an admission of wrongdoing in terms of its past support for climate denial. And of course, the way it was framed is that that's all past. But of course, Exxon advertising itself as working in clean energy, for instance, it's misleading. And so we can come to better understand the ways that Exxon has moved from outright falsehood to misleading framing of the whole issue. And, that's something that once a person understands that is the strategy, it's not that hard to see. So I think more and more people are coming to see that, just across the political spectrum even. But one thing in particular stood out to me, and that's how Exxon is accusing its critics, climate activists, of engaging in a conspiracy against Exxon and against the oil industry. And I think you will see more and more of this basically projection and false symmetry, false equivalence put out by the industry to act like it itself is the victim. But the key is not be intimidated by that, and not to be afraid. I'm sure, I imagine Exxon will use tactics to intimidate, like trying to get subpoenas and things like that, harassing people, maybe tarring their reputations, who knows. But the point is, there's nothing wrong with finding the truth, and there's nothing wrong with telling the truth, and there's nothing wrong with saving the planet. And that is the huge fundamental difference. Exxon is coordinating to sell more fossil fuels. Groups like 350 and its various chapters are coordinating to bring an end to the age of fossil fuels. And the main difference is Exxon is selling a product that is catastrophic for all of human civilization, essentially. And 350 is not, as the last time I checked. So, this sort of false equivalence, I think at times it is a little scary, because, you have a big industry coming after people, but you know, at the end of the day, it's just huffing and puffing. And so, you know, I think that it's just good to kind of keep that in mind. But there's another big lesson, I think, or issue that the video points to, and that is the oil industry's continuing hold on at least some parts of the Democratic Party. You know, and so it's of course easy to see how the Republican Party has essentially done the fossil fuel industry's bidding for years. What can be even harder to come to terms with is that there are parts of the Democratic Party who are still very pro oil and gas. There are other parts of the Democratic Party who they might be more neutral or more ambivalent, but it's still hard for them to take a strong stance against the oil and gas industry. And then, of course, you have another wing of the Democratic Party that is more bold on climate. So this sort of dynamic will probably become very important, you know, during this administration. And, you know, that might be where a lot of the action is in terms of organizing, shifting the center of power within the party itself. You know, Exxon talked about third parties. They do not want to be under oath. They want other people to be under oath. And I think Exxon will be under oath eventually. And this revelation only accelerates that. And, you know, we really need to get to more of these internal discussions. You know, we saw one lobbyist here basically telling the truth because he thought he was in a job interview essentially, and he was bragging about his accomplishments working for ExxonMobil. But he's one of many. And so, you know, this is likely the tip of the iceberg. This is the small keyhole into that room, into a whole house really of activity. And so that's going to be really important to get, you know, like in this year, next year, in the immediate future, and from now on. So I'll leave it at that. That was just sort of my initial reaction to the video. And, you know, I'm interested to hear what Geoffrey's reactions were.
Thanks, Ben. Evening, everybody. Thank you also for having me here tonight. My first reaction was actually a little different. It was the journalist had sent me the written transcript of this recording before it aired. And when it actually aired, I was still stunned by, if you like, the boldness of this, you know, this dramatic sting operation, these reporters going undercover. And it's not really something that we've yet grown. It's very uncommon up till now for reporters to be this bold in effectively targeting the fossil fuel interests in really taking advantage of what frankly is a powerful big tobacco-esque story, a drama. And only just now are we starting to see, you know, a few pioneering journalists and policymakers and others really kind of taking up that mantle and seeing the climate crisis is not just a technocratic problem about greenhouse gases, but also a moral problem about fossil fuels. And, you know, I'm proud to know that, like, through the activism that Ben and I and all of you, you know, in movements like divestment and generally basically everything that 350 has been doing for the last decade, have played, you know, an important role in progressing that narrative, in shifting that narrative about the climate crisis. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, I see this in a way, you know, indirectly as the fruits of the labor of a grassroots movement, you know, down to people like you, who, you know, over the years and currently are, as I said, shifting this narrative and as Ben said, gradually shifting politics too. So that was my kind of visceral reaction, that this thing is just so potent, and as Ben said, there's surely more of this to come. From a slightly more technical perspective, I think I also found it vindicating in a sense, you know, as Ben alluded to, right, that over and over research by us and our colleagues has shown that Exxon in particular and the industry at large has misled the public about climate change, either about basic climate science and its implications in the 90s and the 2000s with really blatant, you know, classic climate denial, and then through the, you know, 2000s, 2010s, with more sort of subtle, insidious forms of delayism, as we call it. And the really profound thing here is seeing it come, as the journalist said in the report, straight from the horse's mouth, right? Like, to my knowledge, it's actually the first time ever that Exxon or a representative of Exxon has acknowledged the company's role in funding climate denial. Back in 2015-16, they explicitly denied that to reporters. You know, we also see Exxon here boasting how it only pretends to support a carbon tax because it makes them look green. We see them boasting about how they attack low carbon technologies because then they can insist that fossil fuels are necessary for the foreseeable future. And actually, there were a couple follow-up reports by Channel 4 and Greenpeace after this particular video, where this chap McCoy, this lobbyist, also admits that they're using exactly the same tactics now, and they intend to in the future on plastics, and also that they use centrist think tanks to, I think his words were, push away bad legislation by generating bits of paper. You know, he said, if you can get them to, if you've got the paper, you win the debate, because you can say, oh, this piece of paper says that's not such a good idea, maybe do this, and then you get over there and another piece of paper says, so yeah, just I think it's very profound that we're seeing confirmation of what we have known and suspected to various degrees. And then the third and final reason the third thought that hit me here was, wow, this is going to cause some waves, because this has that kind of sex appeal that, you know, our peer-reviewed papers and you know, just no reporting has had before. This has got that glossy drama to it, and I think that's what we're seeing. Rokana, the Oversight Committee, I believe, have now invited this lobbyist to testify under oath, and I believe they've also invited the CEO of Exxon and other companies to come in and explain what all this is about. So yeah, happy to be here and to continue this conversation about what this means going forward.
Yeah, and that was my question too. Does the existence of this tape change anything? And maybe it's us, maybe it is up to us to make sure that it does.
Well, I mean, just to carry on that thought immediately. I mean, I'm speaking to some of the people who are kind of involved in the follow-up, if you like, and I have it on pretty certain terms that there is movement happening here. Like Rokana talked about how, you know, before this video, there were a few Congress people interested in his proposal to have an investigation into all this. But afterwards, there's this flood of calls from Congress people saying, are you going to do it now? You know, can I get involved? There's drama, you know, it's this, it's, you know, it's like past social movements. Sometimes you have to have a spectacle, unfortunately, in order to bring an injustice into the light in a way that mobilizes people to action. And I think that's what we're seeing here. So my understanding is that we should expect some sort of hearings pretty imminently, certainly before the end of the year, I believe.
Yeah, I think Kana is talking about hearings in September, I think.
Yes, there's potentially something a bit more imminent, but that's less more ambiguous. But yeah, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's all immediate, right? Compared to this behavior has been going on for 30 plus years now, these campaigns of denial and delay. And so we can wait a couple extra months if we need to. Ben, how about you?
I think you nailed it. I think that's right. And, you know, the tragedy would be if we forgot about this video, or if the world forgot about this video. And thankfully, it sounds like that will not happen. And of course, groups like 350, they can help to ensure that that doesn't happen, because the evidence contained in the video is so frankly damning that there has to be some follow-on as a result. And it sounds like that's happening. So that's exciting to hear.
Well, as we know, the whole climate change phenomenon, unfortunately, is all about tipping points. And a lot of us have worked on divestment for a long time, and various pieces of legislation in different places. And when we have a win, I never know whether we've actually made something happen or whether we're just kind of riding the crest of a wave. But in a case like this, I think that activists need to know what we can do to keep this in front of the public's mind. Presumably Exxon has learned some lessons, and they will start telling their guys to put a sock in it. But maybe it's up to us to keep this front and center. I have a question for Ben. I know that your research has gone way back into the 50s in terms of what the oil companies knew and what they were going to do about it. But we were certainly oblivious for most of that time, it seems. Do you have a sense of when people who were paying attention could have known about Exxon's obfuscation? Were we really in the dark, or were we just not looking?
It's a really good question. So like the research that you alluded to, back by the end of the 1950s, the oil industry had at least been warned about the eventual buildup of CO2 from fossil fuels, that this would presumably cause a global warming effect. And the reason that happened then was because by the end of the 50s, that's when scientists figured out they could measure that CO2 was actually accumulating. And the greenhouse effect, the science of that was already at least somewhat developed. So that was the natural conclusion of that finding of more and more CO2. And by the end of the 60s, the American Petroleum Institute at least was commissioning scientists to evaluate environmental issues. And they also warned the industry about climate change. And, by the 80s, the oil industry had a very sophisticated understanding of what would occur, of how much CO2 would accumulate under business as usual, about how much global warming would happen as a result of that, and then what the impacts would be. So, within the industry, there was this detailed knowledge. Within the scientific community focused on that issue. Yeah, and it's a great book, Losing Earth by Nathaniel Rich. The scientific community that was focused on the issue, they were also aware of these issues. Now, I kind of like, how much was the public aware? I think the public really didn't become aware at a massive scale, until a little bit later, probably by the end of the 1980s or so. Although obviously environmental movements throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s, they would have been paying attention to this issue as well. But when did we know that Exxon was actually concealing part of its knowledge and telling people things that it did not agree with its own knowledge? And for the most part, that awareness came relatively recently, within the last 5 years or so, because that's when the internal documents of Exxon and some of the other oil companies were finally uncovered. There were enterprising journalists in the 90s who were pointing out that the oil industry was, deceiving people about climate change. But unfortunately, they were not listened to enough. And I think it was these internal documents that really made a huge difference in terms of showing people, look, you don't have to even believe me. Look at the documents. You can read them for yourself. And I think that that has made a huge difference in cutting across political lines, because nobody likes to be tricked, and showing people, look, they have been lying to you for decades. So maybe it's time to reevaluate what they're telling us now. And then come, of course, the legal consequences and so on. So it's kind of amazing because, knowledge can be created and also destroyed. It's not a one-way street. In some ways, we have forgotten a lot, and we're now rediscovering what Exxon and the rest of the industry knew decades ago. So, that's why if we just sit back, this progress can be lost and knowledge can be lost. And so that's why we have to keep going. We have to constantly continue forward and raise awareness, and then try to lock in the wins, like you were talking about, through structural changes, whether that's legislation, whether that is, new policy by Facebook, like locking in those structural changes, because of course awareness can wax and wane over time. So, I don't know how much I answered that question, but
I think that's good. I mean,
yeah.
but the notion of knowledge destruction is totally terrifying, I just have to say. So, Geoffrey, can you tell us a little bit about your research methods and how you've been categorizing and measuring obfuscation over? I don't think I understand it well enough to ask you a smart question, but you know what I'm talking about.
That's fine. No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, because I think somehow organically, Ben and I have ended up working on the same, if you like, the same broad issue, but in two slightly different complementary ways. Because Ben is like the digger who goes through these archives and is incredibly good at finding these old documents, pushing back the timeline, right? And revealing more of these insights, these internal documents. Whereas I've taken a slightly different approach of really, essentially, to put it one way, Exxon, when Inside Climate News and the LA Times reported in 2015 this whole corpus of Exxon internal documents, showing that Exxon knew about some of this stuff in the 70s and 80s. Exxon's criticism was, they're journalists, they're biased, and they cherry pick the documents, they cherry pick the quotes. And so my kind of philosophy has been to say, let's step back and look at the whole cherry tree. Let's look at all the documents, everything they said, and let's bring to bear the most rigorous social science methods that we can to try to demonstrate systematic and statistically significant patterns. So in a way, looking back at it, I think this has been like a natural, I have a physics and engineering background. I think this is like a natural way of me approaching this, right? Which is to bring a kind of quantitative approach to generally a qualitative area. So some of my and Naomi's original work essentially did manual, what we call content analysis, where you basically, you develop a systematic framework for saying, okay, for this document and for every other document, we're going to read it and we're going to categorize every single sentence into boxes. Does this sentence promote doubt about climate change, or does it acknowledge it, and to what degree, and so on. And when we did that across all the documents, what we found were systematic discrepancies between, on the one hand, what the company said about climate change in private and academic circles, versus on the other, what it told the public on the op-ed page of the New York Times and other places. And so this systematic discrepancy basically allowed us to conclude that they, almost by definition, misled the public. And they did so by contributing quietly to the science and loudly to promoting doubt about that science. In some of our more recent work, because the industry's tactics have got more subtle and sophisticated, going from you know, just the kind of the really blatant, you know, the science is rubbish, you know, scientists are evil and biased and all that, to more subtle rhetoric and use of language. Our techniques have also had to evolve to keep up with that. And so now we're using more computational approaches. This is you're a Silicon Valley group, so I can use words like machine learning and sort of like big data tools, because another reality is that as people like Ben do more work, as journalists do more work, and as legal discovery yields probably ultimately thousands and millions of documents like it did with the tobacco industry, it's going to get harder and harder to read all of the documents one by one. That's not to say that that approach isn't really valuable, but in complement to that, I want to have the big data tools ready and at our disposal to quickly analyze them all and find patterns. So one thing we did was to use these algorithms to basically read on a computer automatically everything that they've said privately and publicly about climate change. And again, we found really systematic patterns where they overemphasize some terms and topics in public, but very systematically de-emphasize them in private, or vice versa. So one of those patterns was that they fixate in public on consumer energy demand and the role of consumer energy efficiency in addressing climate change. Whereas in private, they often talked about the role of fossil fuels and how fossil fuel burning was causing climate change. So there was this sort of dichotomy in their communication, in how they represented the problem. And so, yeah, that's kind of the way we're going. We've got a lot more work in that direction using these different computational tools. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
No, it's fascinating. And I'm just wondering, I mean, do you anticipate being able to use your data to support lawsuits? I mean, you know, Washington, D.C., Minnesota, there are all sorts of places that are suing the oil companies for consumer fraud and obfuscation. Is that where we're heading with this?
Yeah, so my work and Ben's is cited in much of those, many of those lawsuits, either explicitly or implicitly. Yeah, and I think that our work is becoming, if anything, more valuable when it comes to the lawsuits such as the Massachusetts AG. I think Massachusetts, DC, and one other specifically allege deceptive marketing and greenwashing, as well as the more basic form of climate denial. And when it comes to that stuff, it's that 1 degree harder to prove. And in our computational work, we're able to systematically and statistically significantly show they use all these terms consistent with greenwashing, with other kinds of narratives like fossil fuel solutionism or technological optimism, like various discourses that we know benefit them and shift blame away from them, put the onus on the public. We can now show.
So you can show intent, right? In that way?
We can show that there is a systematic bias in how they're representing the problem. Intent is almost impossible to show unless you have the smoking gun internal document saying, let's do this for that reason. And some of the documents that Ben and others have uncovered have certainly showed us, starting in the late 80s and 90s, they laid down that plan to emphasize uncertainty and extend the science. And these are all quotes of things they said, just like the tobacco industry said. I don't believe, Ben should correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we have quite the same document yet that says, let's do greenwashing quite that bluntly. There were documents in the late 80s that said things like, not just extend the science and emphasize uncertainty, they also said things like emphasize the socioeconomic challenges and emphasize how much it costs and things like that. So kind of slightly more nuanced forms of denial and delay. But I've forgotten your question, but hopefully that answers some of it.
Well, so I just wonder, is there some smoke in Keith McCoy's comments? If you're looking for a smoking gun. I mean, I'm sure they can cut him loose and just say, oh, that guy, we don't know him. But
I don't know, Ben, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that video is a really good example of, frank talk, insider talk that, can show that, that state of mind and that intent. And, another thing to keep in mind is that many of these laws that are being used to hold big oil accountable or try to, they don't necessarily even require an intent part on the part of the oil companies. Like many of the consumer protection laws that some of the states are using, all they require is that the statement itself was likely to mislead a regular person. Something like that might be the standard, depends on the state. But for many of these laws, it doesn't require the company to have intentionally misled or anything like that. So the bar is eminently, the evidence is I would say, in my opinion, I have a JD, but I'm not a lawyer, at least not yet.
You might be in November.
We'll see.
Yeah.
But the evidence is very, very strong, and of course, it's still just accumulating. And I think before this, this event, I wrote down. I was trying to think, what has changed sort of structurally, kind of big time, since, I was trying to think back to when I was doing a lot of activism like 10 years ago. And, I think there are five things I thought of, and I'll offer them for your, food for thought. And I think they have all changed the game, and they're all changing themselves. So first, which we've seen a lot of in the last few months, especially in the West, the American West, is this growing psychological awareness and salience of climate change impacts. Even people I knew who were not, completely sold on climate change, they've been talking to me saying, oh my gosh, did you see what's been happening with this weather? It's so strange, these fires and so on. And I think that is also starting to cut across the political lines, and that is only going to mount. And we're sort of, I think, we are at sort of a psychological tipping point now. And then you have all of this evidence of corporate malfeasance, and that shows one of the reasons why we're in this mess. And and that helps us to focus our energies. Then you have these advances in scientific research that allow for the attribution of individual climate events to global warming. And that's really important for lawsuits. That's really important for public awareness and understanding that, hey, climate change made this extreme storm, 3 times more likely or something. Or in some cases, like heat waves, like, way more likely. Like it would be almost impossible without global warming. And then, and we shouldn't forget either, especially here in Silicon Valley, the clean energy industry is becoming stronger and stronger all the time too. It's always continuing to develop its relative strength compared to the incumbent fossil fuel industry. And so that is also breaking that political monopoly and the market monopoly that the fossil fuel industry has had. And as that erodes, it also becomes easier to imagine replacing the industry. And, in the case of lawsuits, judgments against the industry, something starts to become imaginable, and then possible, and then inevitable. And then, I think we're also seeing that the Paris Agreement is starting to be used in interesting ways around the world. It's starting to be used by courts as an enforceable standard to hold governments to, and to hold even private corporations to. And all of these things, these are all structural changes that are only moving in one direction over time. And so they're all changing the whole activist situation. What are the opportunities that we have. You know, here in Silicon Valley, I think one of the big issues is what is the role of big tech in dealing with climate change and accelerating the movement away from fossil fuels. And we've seen that some of the big tech companies are sort of sitting on the sidelines, and some of them are even exacerbating the climate problem by allowing companies like Exxon to use their platforms to spread propaganda, like the idea that they're, you know, working on clean energy a lot, or even selling their services, like their big data analysis services, to oil companies to help them produce more oil. So especially for 350 Silicon Valley, and especially with, you know, changing political climate and so on, and with revelations like that Exxon video, there may be some new opportunities to push big tech to sever its ties with the fossil fuel industry, and then to affirmatively and actively accelerate the transition and the replacement of fossil fuels. And, you know, that can be a huge, possibly a huge leverage point, you know, for people living around here in Silicon Valley. And so, you know, I think all of these things, everything's always changing. Changing is the whole political and activist dynamic, and, you know, calculus is constantly changing. So I think these structural shifts they're working in our favor. And now the challenge is that solving climate change is a matter of speed first and foremost. It's not a matter of, you know, whether fossil fuels will be replaced. It's what can we do to accelerate that replacement as much as we possibly can. So that wasn't in response to a question at all, but those were just some
No, but that's why we're
big
here.
picture ideas that I
Definitely why we're
thought
here.
I'd offer up.
We have, Ben has to go in 11 minutes. And so I want to ask, Ben, I want to ask you a 90-second question. And then we're going to take questions from everybody else. And Geoffrey might be able to stay on for a few minutes. So ask Ben your questions first. Save your questions for Geoffrey and we'll do the best we can. But what do you think the prospect is for some of these lawsuits?
Well, you know, I think it's only a matter of time before they succeed. And there's a wide range of lawsuits occurring all around the globe. So in the United States, of course, we have these big what are called tort suits. They're suing the fossil fuel industry for damages, for money. Right. And the plaintiffs are cities and states. So that changes that power dynamic again. It's not just nonprofit groups. It's not just activist groups who, you know, unfortunately, as we know, are not always the most powerful members of society. But they're big, powerful governmental organizations who face big costs from climate change, and they want the industry to pay, you know, its fair share for dealing with those damages. And so those, you know, that's one part of it. Elsewhere in the world, where just the legal system is different, there are suits that are asking courts to basically order fossil fuel companies to change their business away from fossil fuels, or order governments to enact more climate protective policies. So, you know, I think we're seeing an activation of the court system all around the world, you know, in response to the fact that the approaches that were taken before have not succeeded enough, you know, in the last few decades, like, you know, the big top-down UN process, you know, which the Paris Agreement I think is great, but, you know, obviously not enough by itself, and so on. So we're seeing that. And, you know, again, I try to think about these things in terms of inevitable shifts. You know, the damages are only going to become greater. The information that we have about the industry is only going to become more full. The ability of science to attribute damages to climate change is only going to improve. These things are only going to move in one direction. And so I think that really it's only a matter of time before, you know, more and more of these suits are successful.
Okay, the less time, the better. So let's go to questions. I'm going to turn it over to Carl, who is going to look at questions in the chat. And also, if you have a question you'd like to ask, raise your hands, your little Zoom hands.
Sure. So Nancy early on in our session had this question: has Coke Industries been approached like this so far? Author of Cokeland obviously did lots of interviews with employees / past employees. The tactics described in this book are so similar. Any plans to go after Coke?
That's a question for Geoffrey, I think.
Is it? Well, I'm not sure if the question is asking like specifically the sting reporting type operation. I mean, in principle, that would be great. I imagine probably a lot of these companies are kind of on high alert to that sort of trickery at the moment. But it's certainly true that it's no coincidence really that the tactics employed are either very similar or complementary to the ones that the companies take. So I don't know. That's a good question. I think I am slightly wondering what you mean by what was the question exactly? It was any plan to go after Coke. I mean, there's certainly been a huge amount of journalism and activism. You know, trying to books like Cokeland. That's a great book. Jane Mayer, you know, classic Dark Money on them.
I can ask a quick question or explain a little better. They've been using similar tactics for such a long time, even, you know, the 50s and 60s, or figure out what to do if they don't have, and it's similar kinds of things. They were responsible for stopping the carbon tax that was planned almost went through Congress in 2009. And also they were in collaboration with Trump, and they don't usually like Trump, but they got together because they did not want to see, they wanted to see the tax cuts. So they were quite responsible for that too, as far as the money and the lobbying for that. And just some big things. And I've just been so curious why no one is really going head on after them when it's so obvious. I guess that's my.
Yeah, I mean, I think of exceptions to that, like Sheldon Whitehouse, senator from Rhode Island, who has really just literally week after week for years been talking about the influence of dark money, the role of Citizens United in, you know, for freeing up entities like the Cokes to just funnel massive amounts into these kind of third-party propaganda campaigns, lobbying efforts. So he was on the Channel 4 show before me talking about this investigation, and he talked about the need, you know, basically for more transparency in terms of, like, we need to be able to follow the money in all this. I think that's, I don't, I'm not an expert, but I think that's probably more of an ambition or a wish than a practical reality in the near future. I mean, it's I think the question, maybe I might rephrase it as like, what, like, certainly makes sense that they should be held more accountable. And the question is, how can one do so most effectively? One prominent campaign that I kind of interface with from here and there was a campaign called Uncoke My Campus, which was an effort, or it is an ongoing grassroots effort to try to get, try to confront and challenge Coke industry funding of academia that is, you know, really introducing massive conflicts of interest. At MIT, where I did my PhD, he'd given 250 million, I want to say, to MIT. He was a life member of the board. So, you know, when you come to ask a place like MIT if it's going to divest from fossil fuels, it's a problem because David Koch was literally sitting in the room while they make the decision. So that's really naming the problem rather than answering the question. I don't think there is an easy answer. I don't know if, Ben, you have any, you've used this time to formulate a more clever answer.
Frantically trying to think of a good answer. I mean, I think the question is, where are the pressure points? You know, the Coke Industries, you know, I mean, it's not a public corporation, I don't think.
Right.
And it's also been probably they've been lobbying a lot, but more quiet in terms of public communication and advertising. And those are the sorts of things that are getting Exxon and some of the other big, public oil majors in trouble. So the question is, where are the pressure points for a company like Coke? Is it harder to find out, for one thing, what they have been doing, what their activities have been? They are a defendant in the lawsuit brought by Minnesota, by the Attorney General of Minnesota.
Mhm.
So I think there is some movement in that direction. These legal cases are also experimenting with different approaches. They're refining their strategies and their techniques. Who's a potential defendant? That's always being analyzed and considered, what is the best approach. So there might be more movement in that direction. And, some of these investigations of the company that Geoffrey mentioned, these might be the sort of foundational studies that allow, more and more information to be found, and maybe more opportunities to hold that company accountable as well.
Thank you.
That's great. I want to ask Debbie's question before you have to go, Ben. Maybe both of you can answer this. She says, what do you foresee as Exxon's end game? How will they end up? A bankrupt company like Enron, or will they evolve into an energy company that takes over the renewables market or tries to make its fortune on plastics, which will kill us all anyway? But what do you think what do you see as the end game for Exxon?
Ben, why don't you go first?
I was
just
going to
'cause you
make
have to
you go first.
I mean, I can if you want, but
No,
yeah.
it's okay.
Yeah.
These are just some ideas. I don't have any special knowledge on this or anything. I think we see that the oil companies are trying to still promote natural gas, as a sort of low carbon or bridge fuel. They're going to continue to do that probably, but that myth is starting to be busted, thankfully, although it probably should have been busted like 10 or 20 years ago, but now that's starting to finally happen. We see more and more activity in plastics and promotion of plastics, as you mentioned. I think they'll continue to do that. And a lot of people aren't aware that, the companies that are involved with making plastics are, these big oil companies as well. So that's an important thing for the public to understand, in addition to the growing revelations that recycling as a concept is, not all it's cracked up to be, and was deployed by oil companies and the plastic industry to get the public to think that plastic was fundamentally sustainable, even though it was not and is not. And, that is a growing issue as well. And there are also lawsuits based on that now, very recent ones as well. So, I think we'll see that. Now, whether the big oil companies will turn into diversified energy companies or clean energy companies, I think everybody has a different prediction about this. I personally think they will not, because the core competencies in, say solar energy are vastly different than being an oil company, and they're not transferable necessarily, or, the amount of core competencies that are transferable are pretty limited. In addition, the nature of the oil industry is such that they're making investments on resources that they hope to, develop over the coming decades. So if they move to undermine fossil fuels at any time, essentially, or at least now, they're going to be undercutting their own, existing investments, or at least somewhat doing that. So, I don't see a lot of ways for those companies to change. I know some people say they have the money. If only it were that easy. It's the money. The shortage of money has never really been the problem for this issue. So, but that's just my sort of speculation, and I don't know if that's correct or not. I know that there are some fossil fuel companies who have more, and I'm thinking of some of the state-owned Scandinavian oil companies that maybe have done better than the private oil companies. So, I want to keep an open mind, but it's also important to be realistic about, what these companies are actually doing in terms of their investments and what they can do. And I think I'll start to change my mind when I see Exxon spending, more than 50% of its capital investment in renewable energy instead of like 0.2% as it's doing today.
What do you think, Geoffrey?
I mean, I echo all of that. By the way, Ben, if you need to hop off at any point, I won't be offended. No, I echo all of that. I think that for no particular reason other than, kind of the history of how other industries have waxed and waned, there are likely going to be a few companies who are right at the forefront of trying to shift, and then the laggards who get left behind. And certainly Exxon in particular, and American companies in general, have really just got way lost in the past compared to some of the more progressive, or at least sophisticated European companies in terms of at least presenting a greener front, and to some extent, investing, say like 3 or 4% versus 1 or 0.5% of Exxon. So there's a kind of a little divergence already there in both the rhetoric and the spending, and at least like the pledging of plans and ambitions and things. I think that these companies specialize in fluid flowing through pipes. So as Ben was saying, they are going to fight, and they are tooth and nail to ensure that natural gas is maintained. This is why Exxon is so obsessed with biofuels and algae, because it presents a panacea, a silver bullet for how they could keep the energy flowing through their pipes. Petrochemicals, plastics truly are like a huge plan B for them. So I think that is actually, they're saying like how they're planning to kind of shift some of their emphasis. But yeah, I think it's
carbon capture and storage, which they are.
Yes, thank you. So I mean, again, that's another of those kind of silver bullets that they are touting as, a potential solution. Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is, it can be hard at this point in time to look at some massive multinational like Exxon and envision it going the way of Enron. But I think bear in mind that 10 years ago, Exxon was the biggest company in the history of money. And now it's been dropped from the Dow Jones after, a century of being on there. So these things can change all of a sudden. And we are seeing that these companies are terrible investments now. So I think it's not that hard to envision this combination of grassroots, political, legal, economic, technological pressures all becoming a bit too much for them. But I mean, obviously, this is kind of crystal ball speculation to some extent. But yeah, those are my immediate thoughts.
A great answer. So, Carl, do you want to take some more questions from the chat or from humans?
Yeah, we have some more from the chat. Olga had potentially a yes or no question. Have any regulatory agencies or government agencies showed any interest in your work? I'm not going to go to either.
Government agencies. I speak to a variety of politicians and lawyers. I don't know if I've spoken to like regulatory agencies. Have you been?
No, I haven't. But I think something to keep our eye on is, will the new Department of Justice pursue an investigation and possibly a case, against fossil fuel industry?
Yeah.
There is sorry, go ahead.
No, finish.
I was just going to say that, there was an important part of the, one of the big or not the last one, but the big RICO case against big tobacco, which was concluded in the 2000s. one of the big holdings, one of the big conclusions from that case was that lobbying activity is not protected by the First Amendment if it's fraudulent, if it's misleading. You know, you cannot lie to the government. So, you know, I think now if the Department of Justice investigates, you know, there could be very interesting examination of the lobbying activities of big oil, at least, you know, over the last decades. And if big oil has also been misleading the government about, you know, the certainty of climate change and all of that, then arguably that is not protected under the First Amendment. So, you know, that would be very, very interesting to see if that happens.
And by the way, you know, in terms of what can activists do and all that, like, it's worth remembering that, you know, the Biden administration committed both during the campaign and after being elected to support climate litigation. So I think they should be held to that standard. And like Ben was saying, they should, you know, order the Department of Justice to launch investigations. So yeah, I think maybe we will be speaking to regulatory agencies at some point.
Great.
Awesome.
Here. I know we have a bunch of questions. I don't know if we got to all of them. Hopefully we can ask some of them to you both on Twitter maybe later. So if we don't reach them, I just wanted to throw that out there. Suds had a question which harkens back to your last answer, Ben. So is Exxon worse than the other oil companies? And related to that somewhat, did a $200 billion settlement with tobacco really change anything?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Is Exxon worse? I think that there's been a lot of attention on Exxon, partly because the documents were found. As far as we know about the other oil companies, they were also aware of the issue around the same time that Exxon was. They've also, you know, participated in misleading public communication about the issue. Some new research that hopefully will be out soon, historical work, has found that I was involved in, has found that Exxon did play the role of a ringleader in organizing the whole international petroleum industry in the 80s and sort of since then in opposing climate policies. So, you know, maybe Exxon is a little bit like the Philip Morris, you know, of the industry. It's not alone, but it's really important as an industry leader, essentially. So I think, you know, there'll be a ton of attention on Exxon, but it won't be limited to that. And I forget, what was the second part of the question? Oh, did the tobacco settlement really change much? Now, yeah, I mean, that was a huge settlement. You know, I think it probably did change at least some things. It dissolved the trade associations for the tobacco industry. It placed many limits on the ability of the industry to, you know, send its message to, you know, young prospective smokers. Now the big criticism of the settlement was that money was not earmarked for stopping people from smoking or helping people get off of smoking. And so that may have been a mistake that should not be replicated this time. And, you know, I mean, I think we don't know exactly how these lawsuits will shake out, but if you think about the amount of damage done, you know, these suits have the potential to be the biggest judgment or award or settlement, you know, ever, potentially. Could be bigger, maybe even much bigger than tobacco. And we've seen with the recent opioid litigation that, you know, these sorts of corporate accountability outcomes are possible. They're still possible. So, and in some ways they're even stronger. So, you know, we'll see. I think we'll see what happens. And, you know, the industry will probably try to attain immunity from the lawsuits through an act of Congress. They've already tried to do that once, kind of sneaking it in exchange for a carbon tax. So we'll have to keep watching to see if they try to do that again.
One thing I've been meaning to mention is Ro Khanna. He represents like the East Bay of of the Bay Area. Have I got that
South
right?
Bay.
Like,
South
yeah.
Bay.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I just mentioned that because, well, I mean, I presume some of you are around there, and so I feel like his office could never. I imagine that, you know, all the support that they can feel in terms of, you know, the public being behind them on this effort, because he's really just taken the lead on this. I just meant to make a note of that since you're all out there. Yeah.
Great. And then Sandy had a next question. Now that we know for sure that Exxon knew, do you think that the government might step in and restrict oil companies' abilities to advertise their products in media, including social media, as has happened with tobacco?
So there are several dozen campaigns worldwide pushing to regulate in some way fossil fuel advertising, whether that be to ban it outright or to require that it come with tobacco style warning labels. I believe Amsterdam or some other city in that region already has passed a law recently banning at least some sort of fossil fuel interest advertising. So it's certainly not inconceivable. And Client Earth, a legal group in London, have like drawn up sketches of what all those tobacco warning labels might look like on ads. I feel like in the US, I feel like in the US generally these things are harder to implement. But going back to what we were talking about before, you know, the role of social media, and again I mention this especially because you're in the area where all this stuff happens. You know, so social media company platforms are now playing a very facilitating role in giving a home to all these paid adverts, targeted adverts by fossil fuel interests. So that's one way. Even you could circumvent political issues if you could, in principle, compel private, social media companies to do the right thing in terms of limiting. And so there are some steps. Some colleagues of mine are involved in like Facebook's climate information center that's supposed to, provide disclaimers on misleading messaging about climate on Facebook. And so there are various kind of initiatives going on in that regard. In terms of whether the government's going to step in and just ban fossil fuel advertising, I think, again, one of the outcomes, Ben, am I right? And one of the outcomes of the master settlement on tobacco was that they had to stop advertising, like they basically had to stop advertising and make cigarette packets blank and all that.
Yeah,
stuff.
I believe so.
Yeah.
I think it was, I kind of forget like which outcome,
yeah.
which case that was, or which settlement, but yeah, and that did happen at some point.
Yeah. So that's a partial answer to the question.
Okay, great. Mariana wanted to ask, going back to the video, Keith McCoy said that a carbon tax on everyone would not go over. By everyone, does he mean people in general? CCL's carbon tax is structured to benefit the ordinary person, tax producers, etc. So you just explain that for everyone, whoever wanted to.
I think when he talked about that, he talked about how it's just not politically feasible to pass it. So my read was that he was talking about the feasibility on the Hill of a carbon tax legislation passing. But I'm obviously, thankfully, I'm not in his head, so I don't know for sure. But yeah, and then, that's another thing Ben alluded to. When it comes to any carbon tax kind of push to ensure a carbon tax, just always make sure you've looked at the fine print and there's no proposal for immunity, because they're trying to get that in under the radar. But other than that, obviously, it's an important piece of policy in complement with lots of others.
And then I'm going to rephrase Mary's question a little bit, but I'll start with her premise. It is frightening to hear how Exxon can strategically plan what version of disinformation they present to which group. Is there social science guidance on how to plan a campaign to identify and successfully combat these alternate truths? So yeah, I'm curious. I know Geoffrey, you have the research on what they're doing in the language differences they're using. As there are any learnings from that about how we can combat that messaging?
So the question is, how to combat messaging that is targeted at different groups.
How to combat this alternate
Misinformation
truths.
in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so John Cook and Ed Maybach, and they're at George Mason University, Steve Lewandowski and Sander van der Linden in Cambridge and Bristol in the UK, they and others have done really good work on what's called inoculation theory. So that's the idea, just like a drug, inoculation against a disease. If you can preempt disinformation by alerting people to the message and the messengers that one might expect from a deceptive source, and you debunk that, you can raise people's guards, just like putting in some antibodies in a vaccination can raise the body's defenses and give people some immunity to disinformation. So the broad takeaway from that is it's extremely important for us to have these kinds of conversations, and to, everyone here to go talk to your friends and family about this history, this awareness that we now have, because unless people are aware of it, it's so easy to just fly under the radar of your subconscious, especially with this more subversive stuff like greenwashing, individualization of responsibility. I mean, look at the way recycling, right, for decades just societally convinced everybody, even those who are really alert to the issue. So yeah, I would say that's the key piece of social science that I'm aware of for raising people's defenses against disinformation. And that is something that those are my colleagues who are involved with Facebook, trying to get them to implement some of those warning labels, basically. Yeah.
This is really fabulous. I think we've kept Geoffrey up late enough, and Ben is late for his 7 o'clock. And we're so grateful to everyone for being here and sticking around. I knew this would be great. It's much better than I expected. It's really good. And
Thank you
I'm
both
just
so much.
so grateful to both of you and to everyone for coming. And I just want to say, we are raising money. You can just go to www.350siliconvalley.org, click the donate button and add to your contributions, because we need it. But mostly I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I
All
mean,
of
thanks
you.
for organizing this, and thanks for all of you for being here, and just more broadly for everything you're doing. That's really, really important.
Yeah, likewise. It's a pleasure to be here. And Ben and I are both on Twitter, and you can find our emails online and all that. So I won't speak for Ben, but I'm always happy to, always happy for you to reach out if you have any follow-up questions, if we didn't answer your questions, all that kind of stuff.
We are going to distribute the video to everyone who is here and everybody who isn't here, and we'll add your Twitter handles to the email when we distribute that link, so everybody will be able to stay in touch. It's just fabulous.
And please remember that we're always at your service if you can think of things that we can do here, and you mentioned some today that could be helpful. We are very open to hearing your ideas.
And as you know, we can put together a great program at the drop of a hat. So if you've got any ideas, just call us. We'll make it happen.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Have a great
Boston.
night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cheerio.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.